Universal horror. Unleashed doorways to real nightmares. Dracula. Frankenstein's monster. The Wolfman. These weren't just movie monsters. They were a prophecy. For almost 100 years, these names have been the definition of fear. They're the titans of terror, the godfathers of Gothic, born from grainy black and white film. They wrote the rule book for everything that would ever scare us. But they're so much more than characters in old movies. They're living, breathing metaphors that crawled right out of the silver screen and into our collective nightmares. But how did they do it? How did these figures, cooked up on a studio backlot during the Great Depression, break free from their celluloid prisons to become timeless symbols of our deepest cultural fears? What's the secret to their immortality? To get it, we have to go back to a time of sheer desperation, when a struggling film studio named Universal gambled everything on the darkness hiding in the human heart. They didn't just invent a genre, they gave a face to our nightmares, and in doing so, they unleashed them on the world forever. The blueprint of fear. It all kicks off in the long shadow of the Great Depression. The world was paralyzed by economic collapse, social chaos, and this feeling of being utterly helpless. For Universal Studios, it was do or die. The studio was teetering on the edge of collapse, and in a last-ditch effort to survive, they turned to a genre most of Hollywood looked down on as cheap and dangerous: horror. Pulling inspiration from the stark psychological terror of German Expressionism, Universal wasn't just making scary movies, they were forging a new mythology. Directors like Todd Browning and James Whale, with the genius makeup artist Jack Pierce, became the architects of this new age of terror. They knew that real horror wasn't about a cheap jump scare. It was about atmosphere, psychology, and a deep, creeping dread. Their films, starting with Dracula and Frankenstein in 1931, created a visual and thematic language that would define horror for a century. They sculpted monsters who weren't just evil, but were often tragic, sympathetic, and deeply human. These weren't just creatures, they were Gothic warnings, allegories for the anxieties of the era. Universal was tapping into the very real fears of its audience. Fear of the foreigner, of science without a conscience, of the beast inside all of us, and blasting them onto the screen in terrifying, larger-than-life fashion. They had found the blueprint, the archetypes of fear. What makes these monsters last forever is that they aren't just characters, they're archetypes. Each one represents a fundamental, universal human fear. First, you've got Dracula, the picture of aristocratic evil and the fear of the seductive stranger. When Bela Lugosi glided onto the screen in 1931, he wasn't just a vampire, he was a symbol of foreign contagion. With his hypnotic stare and his elegant yet deeply unnerving European charm, he was the fear of the other, an ancient, corrupting force invading the modern world, promising eternal life, but only bringing death. He embodied anxieties about disease and the breakdown of society, all coming from a charismatic, predatory influence. He's the fear of what we secretly want, and what might just destroy us if we let it in. Then there's Frankenstein's monster, the ultimate symbol of science gone wrong and the tragic outsider. Boris Karloff's performance, guided by the masterful James Whale, wasn't about pure evil, but about deep, heartbreaking pathos. The monster is essentially a child, thrown into the world by a reckless creator, only to be hated and hunted for the way he looks. He is the fear of creation without a conscience, of technology that moves faster than our own morality. His tragedy is our own deepest fear of being alone, of being misunderstood, judged, and thrown out by a world that won't see past the surface. The horror of Frankenstein isn't the monster. It's what humanity did to him. And that brings us to the Wolfman. He's maybe the most relatable of them all because he represents the terrifying loss of control, the fear of the beast within. Larry Talbot is a good man, just cursed by a fate he never asked for and can't escape. His transformation isn't a choice, it's a violent, agonizing disease. This plugs directly into our primal fear of our own dark impulses, the savage passions we fight to keep locked away. Released in 1941, as the world was spiraling into the madness of war, the Wolfman was a powerful metaphor for inherited violence and the beast that can awaken in even the most civilized person. He's the terrifying proof that the greatest monster we'll ever face is probably staring back at us in the mirror. Finally, you have the fear of a past that won't stay dead, embodied by the mummy, and the fear of the unknown, bubbling up from the depths with the creature from the Black Lagoon. The mummy is all about our anxiety over ancient curses and colonial guilt, the idea that the sins of the past will always come back for revenge. The creature, one of the last of the classic lineup, taps into fears of evolution, the primal unknown, and nature itself lashing out against us. Together, this pantheon was complete, giving a face to our anxieties about time, history, and the dark, unexplored corners of our world. Each of these monsters is a doorway to a different nightmare, a different side of our own anxieties. They force us to ask big questions about who we are and what truly scares us. So I have to ask you, who is your favorite universal monster? And what fear do you think they represent most powerfully? Let me know in the comments. Escaping the silver screen. The power of these archetypes was so massive they couldn't be held in their own movies. They started bleeding into the culture itself. Universal actually pioneered the shared cinematic universe with films like Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, creating a world where all these nightmares could bump into each other long before anyone else thought of it. The monsters became household names, their silhouettes as famous as any pop culture icon. Their influence is baked into the DNA of modern horror. Every story about a charming, deadly vampire owes a drink to Bela Lugosi's Dracula. Every tale of a misunderstood, tragic monster is walking in the giant footsteps of Boris Karloff's creation. The internal struggle of the werewolf, the slasher who feels like an unstoppable force, the ancient curse on the family home. All of these ideas are branches on the tree universal, planted back in the 30s. When the 60s and 70s shifted to more psychological horror, with human killers in films like Psycho and Halloween, it wasn't a rejection of the universal monsters. It was an evolution. The horror just moved from a gothic castle to the house next door. The monster was no longer a creature, but a sickness in the mind. The blueprint was still there, and even now, their legacy is fiercely protected and endlessly re-examined. The box office failure of big-budget reboots like 2017's The Mummy showed that audiences don't want these figures as simple action heroes. In contrast, successes like Lee Wannell's The Invisible Man in 2020 and his follow-up Wolfman in January 2025 proved that these monsters thrive when they return to their roots. As focused, psychological stories about modern fears like gaslighting, domestic abuse, and generational trauma. Universal's current strategy of letting filmmakers create standalone visions seems to finally understand this powerful truth. So, how did these black and white characters become timeless symbols of terror? The answer is simpler than you'd think. Universal Pictures didn't just create monsters. They held up a mirror. They gave us figures that were both terrifying and tragic, monstrous and yet uncomfortably, undeniably human. They are the outsider, the outcast, and the beast that rages inside our own souls. They are doorways to real nightmares because the fears they represent never left. Fear of the other, fear of our own creations, fear of losing control. These are the anxieties that have haunted us for centuries, and they aren't going anywhere. Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and the Wolfman aren't just relics. They are timeless prophecies, forever etched into our culture, reminding us that the most terrifying monsters are always the ones that reflect the darkness we carry inside ourselves. They are immortal, not because they can't be killed on screen, but because the fears they represent can never truly die. Thank you for watching Fear Files Real Nightmares. Until next time, keep your lights on and your doors locked.